I bought a pine farm legally, outside the HOA. A week later, I drove past my own land and saw strangers cutting and selling my Christmas trees, under Karen's name. If you believe real ownership always beats fake authority, subscribe now, because this story proves how fast entitlement collapses when the truth comes out. The pine farm smelled like winter before winter had even arrived. That sharp, clean scent of resin and cold air clung to everything, the kind that makes you breathe deeper without thinking about it. I stood near the gravel entrance the morning after closing on the property, looking out over rows of tall, healthy pines stretching farther than the eye could comfortably follow. This land had been a long-term plan, not a flip, not a side hustle, a real investment. Outside HOA boundaries, properly surveyed, legally recorded. I'd done my homework carefully because land disputes don't start with shouting. They start with assumptions. The previous owner had been clear. No HOA jurisdiction. No shared use agreements. No seasonal contracts. The pine farm was private property, plain and simple. That clarity was the reason I bought it. For the first few days, everything was quiet. No trucks. No foot traffic, just the wind moving through branches and the distant sound of a road that never came close enough to matter. I spent those mornings walking the rows, checking tags, planning future harvest schedules. Christmas tree season was coming, but I had no intention of opening early. Then, on the fourth day, I noticed tire tracks that hadn't been there before. They cut across the access path near the south fence, shallow but unmistakable, fresh. Someone had driven in and out. I told myself it was probably the previous owner retrieving something he'd forgotten. It wouldn't be the first time. But when I followed the tracks deeper into the property, the explanation stopped making sense. Several trees were gone, not damaged, not fallen, cleanly cut. Stumps trimmed the way someone trims when they plan to sell, not when they're stealing casually. The ground around them was flattened from foot traffic. Needles scattered in neat arcs where branches had been shaken loose. This wasn't random. It was organized. I took photos from multiple angles. Stumps. Track surroundings. Documentation has a rhythm to it. You learn where to point the camera after you've been through enough property transactions. I marked the GPS coordinates without thinking, a habit picked up from dealing with surveyors and inspectors. Then I left. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't post signs. I didn't call the police. Not yet. Because something about the cuts bothered me. They were too deliberate. Too confident. Confidence usually means someone believes they have permission. That afternoon, I drove toward the nearby neighborhood bordering the property line. It wasn't part of the HOA either, but it fed into one, a common setup where lines get blurry if no one checks. That's where I saw it. A makeshift Christmas tree stand. Pines stacked neatly in rows. Fresh cuts. Handwritten price signs. And standing behind it, directing traffic like she owned the place, was Karen. She was talking animatedly to a couple loading a tree into the back of a truck, smiling like this was a community service. She wore bright seasonal clothing and had a clipboard tucked under her arm. A donation jar sat near the cash box, labeled with vague wording about holiday funds. I parked across the street and watched. The trees matched mine exactly. Same height range. Same trimming style. Same subtle markings on the bark from a disease unique to that section of the farm. There was no doubt. She was selling my trees. I waited until the customers left before approaching. Not out of fear, out of patience. People who rely on assumed authority unravel faster when there's no audience. I asked where the trees came from. She answered immediately, without hesitation. She said they were from the community land. She said the HOA had always handled seasonal tree sales. She said it was a tradition, and proceeds helped the neighborhood. I told her I owned the land she was cutting from. She laughed. Not mockingly, casually. The laugh of someone who has never been challenged seriously. She said that land had always been open. That no one minded. That it was understood. She didn't ask for proof. She didn't ask for clarification. She dismissed the claim outright. I told her I bought the pine farm less than a week earlier. I told her I had the deed. I told her it was outside HOA jurisdiction. Her smile tightened. She said if that were true, the HOA would have been notified. She said I should take it up with them. She said the sale was already underway and stopping it would disrupt the community. That word again, community. It gets used a lot when someone is standing on land they don't own. I asked how many trees she'd sold so far. She didn't answer. Instead, she told me I was being unreasonable. She said it was Christmas season. She said traditions mattered. She said paperwork didn't change what people had always done. I didn't argue. I told her to keep selling. The look on her face shifted, confusion mixing with relief. She thought she'd won, that I'd back down the way others probably had before. She turned back to the stand, already calling over the next customer. I walked back to my car calmly, heart steady, mind already moving ahead. Because what she didn't realize, what she couldn't see yet, was that she hadn't just sold a few trees. She'd created a paper trail. And once money changes hands on someone else's land, exposure becomes inevitable. I didn't leave the area right away. Instead, I parked far enough down the road to watch, without being obvious. From that distance, the stand looked festive. Lights strung between posts. Wreaths hanging from a temporary fence. A chalkboard sign advertising fresh local pines. Anyone driving by would have assumed it was legitimate. That was the problem. Legitimacy isn't created by decorations or confidence. It's created by permission, and she had none. Over the next hour, I watched at least 7 transactions. Cash exchanged. A card reader came out once, plugged into phone. Each sale ended the same way. Smiles, thanks, and a tree disappearing into a vehicle. With every one, the knot in my stomach tightened, not from anger, but from certainty. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a business. When she finally stepped away to take a call, I moved closer again. Not to confront her, but to document. I took wide shots of the stand, close-ups of the price signs, photos of the trees themselves. I captured the license plates of vehicles loading trees, not to accuse buyers, but to establish scale. Quantity matters when money is involved. I counted stumps again that evening. 12 trees were gone. Each one had been cut cleanly, transported, and sold. At seasonal prices, that wasn't petty theft. It was a pattern. And patterns trigger a different level of response. That night, I pulled the property file and read through everything again. Deed. Survey. County zoning maps. The farm's boundary was clear, marked, and recorded. There was no ambiguity. The land didn't touch HOA property. It didn't overlap any easements. The access path she'd used crossed my fence line entirely. I checked permits next. No seasonal sales license had been issued for that address. No temporary vendor permits. No charitable authorization. The donation jar label was vague enough to mean nothing and specific enough to mislead. By morning, I had a folder. Receipts from the previous owner showing past private sales. My purchase agreement. Photos with timestamps. GPS coordinates. Screenshots of HOA maps showing their jurisdiction stopping short of my fence. I didn't need to rush. Every hour, she continued selling only strengthened the case. When I returned the next day, the stand was busier. Word had spread. People love local Christmas trees, especially when they believe they're supporting the community. She leaned into that image, greeting customers like a host. I noticed a small sign now claiming proceeds supported neighborhood holiday projects. Still no name. Still no registration. I waited until a lull. When I approached again, she was less friendly this time. She remembered me. Her tone was sharper, more defensive. She asked if I'd spoken to the HOA yet. She said they were aware of the sale. She said everything was approved. I asked for the approval in writing. She said it wasn't necessary. That answer told me everything. I told her calmly that I would be shutting the operation down, not through argument, but through documentation. I told her every tree sold was recorded, every cut documented, every dollar traceable. I told her that selling someone else's property without permission carried consequences she probably hadn't considered. She scoffed. She said I was overreacting. She said the land had always been used this way. She said no one had complained before. And then she said something that crossed from ignorance into liability. She said the HOA would handle anyone who tried to interfere. That night, I sent emails. County Zoning, Agricultural Extension Office, Consumer Protection, and finally, the HOA board itself. I attached documentation and asked a single neutral question in each message. Who authorized the sale of trees for my property? I didn't accuse. I didn't threaten. I asked for clarification. By the time I went to sleep, I knew what would happen next. Because when people build a business on land they don't own, the truth doesn't stay buried long. It surfaces. And when it does, it takes everything with it. The first response came early the next morning, long before the stand opened for the day. It wasn't from Karen. It wasn't from the HOA board either. It was from the County Agricultural Office. The message was short, factual, and careful. They confirmed they had no record of any licensed Christmas tree sales tied to my property or the adjacent neighborhood. They asked whether the activity was ongoing and requested the exact location. I replied with coordinates, photos, and timestamps. No commentary, just evidence. An hour later, Consumer Protection followed up. They acknowledged receipt of my complaint and asked for proof of ownership. I attached the deed and purchase agreement. Again, no accusations, just confirmation. By mid-morning, the HOA board finally responded. Their tone was noticeably different from the confidence Karen had displayed. They said they were unaware of any tree sales occurring outside HOA property. They asked for clarification on boundaries and whether the sale had been formally approved. The phrasing told me everything. They weren't defending her. They were distancing themselves. That was the crack. I drove back toward the stand around noon. From a distance, it looked unchanged. Same decorations, same signs, same confidence. But when I got closer, I noticed fewer trees on display and more nervous movement behind the table. Karen kept checking her phone between customers, her posture tighter than the day before. I didn't approach her. Instead, I waited. Shortly after 1 o'clock, a county vehicle pulled up across the road. No lights, no sirens, just an official seal on the door and 2 people stepping out with clipboards. They didn't head straight for the stand. They surveyed first. Photos, notes, quiet observation. Karen noticed them immediately. Her smile vanished. She stepped away from a customer mid-conversation and walked quickly toward the road, intercepting them before they reached the trees. From where I stood, I could see her gesturing broadly, pointing toward the neighborhood, then back toward the farm. They listened. They nodded. Then one of them asked a question that made her freeze. Who owned the land the trees came from? She pointed vaguely toward the farm and said it was community land. The official asked for documentation. She didn't have any. She said the HOA had always allowed it. The official asked again, this time more precisely. Who owned the land? That was when I stepped forward. I didn't interrupt. I didn't raise my voice. I waited until the official looked in my direction and asked whether I was involved. I said yes. I said I owned the Pine Farm. I handed over the folder I'd prepared. Deeds, survey maps, photos of the cut stumps, time-stamped images of the stand, a list of dates and estimated quantity sold. The tone changed instantly. The official stopped taking notes casually and started documenting deliberately. Measurements were taken, tree tags examined, stump diameters compared. Everything matched. There was no ambiguity left. Karen tried to speak again, faster now, explaining traditions and community benefit and seasonal expectations. The officials listened politely, then explained that selling agricultural products from land you don't own or have permission to use is illegal. That misrepresenting the source of goods to consumers is a violation. That collecting money under vague charitable claims without registration is another issue entirely. Her face drained of color. They asked her how many trees she had sold. She said she didn't know. They asked her where the money was. She said it went toward community projects. They asked for records. She had none. The stand was shut down on the spot. A notice was posted. Sales ceased immediately. Remaining trees were tagged as evidence. Karen was instructed not to remove or sell anything further until the matter was resolved. She didn't argue this time. She stood there silent, arms at her sides, watching customers turn away in confusion. Neighbors gathered quietly. Phones came out. Whispers spread. The confidence that had fueled the operation collapsed under the weight of documentation. I walked back toward the farm afterward, the smell of cut pine still heavy in the air. The stumps hadn't moved. The evidence hadn't disappeared. And now, neither would the consequences. Because once authorities step in, the story stops being about tradition. It becomes about ownership. And ownership is something paperwork never lies about. The shutdown didn't end the activity immediately. It ended the illusion. The stand stayed up for the rest of the afternoon, but no one was allowed to touch it. Trees sat where they were, tagged and counted, no longer products but evidence. The festive decorations looked out of place now, like props left behind after a performance that had gone wrong. Karen stayed nearby, phone in hand, pacing. She made several calls, her voice low and urgent. Each one ended the same way, shorter than the last. Whatever answers she expected weren't coming. When authority shifts from assumption to verification, the room gets very quiet very fast. By early evening, the HOA board sent another message. This one went to every resident. It stated that the tree sale had not been authorized by the association, that the land involved was privately owned, and that the HOA was cooperating fully with county officials. The word cooperating was deliberate. It was the sound of distance being created. Neighbors reacted in real time. Conversations sparked along sidewalks and driveways. People who had bought trees earlier wondered what that meant for them. Others admitted they'd always assumed the land was communal because it had been treated that way for years. Assumptions surfaced everywhere, exposed by a single question no one had bothered to ask before. Who owns it? That night, I walked the farm again. The rows felt different, not because trees were missing, but because the quiet had returned. No vehicles, no voices, just wind through branches and the soft crunch of needles underfoot. I counted again to be sure. 14 trees gone now, not 12. The difference mattered. I updated the folder. The next morning, the county followed up with a formal notice. It outlined the violations under review: unauthorized agricultural sales, misrepresentation to consumers, and potential theft of property. Each line was neutral, procedural, and final. The matter had moved beyond argument. Karen's name appeared on the notice. The HOA board requested a meeting that afternoon. Not a confrontation, a clarification. I agreed to attend, provided it was on record. The room was small and plainly furnished, the kind of space where enthusiasm goes to be replaced by caution. Board members sat with printed documents in front of them. Legal counsel joined by phone. They asked me to walk through the timeline. I did, slowly, without emphasis. Purchase date. Discovery of the cuts. Observation of the sale. Documentation. Notifications. County response. I didn't speculate about motives. I didn't accuse anyone of intent. I described actions and dates. Counsel asked questions that narrowed the issue further. Boundaries. Prior agreements. Any permissions granted. The answers were simple. None. 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 The board acknowledged, on record, that the HOA had no jurisdiction over the farm. They acknowledged that no authorization had been given for the sale. They acknowledged that a volunteer had acted independently. Volunteer was their word, not mine. It was careful language, meant to contain liability. They asked what I wanted. I told them I wanted 3 things. First, a written acknowledgement that the land was private and outside HOA control. Second, restitution for the trees sold, based on market value. Third, a public notice correcting the misrepresentation made to buyers. There was no argument. They said they would comply. By the end of the meeting, a draft notice was already circulating. It clarified boundaries. It stated that the sale had been unauthorized. It advised purchasers to contact the HOA for refunds. The speed told me how serious the exposure was. Later that day, the stand was dismantled. Decorations came down. Tables folded. Unsold trees were removed under supervision, returned to the farm's edge to be accounted for. The road looked ordinary again, but the memory lingered. Karen didn't come back. I learned later that evening that Consumer Protection had opened a case regarding the money collected. Receipts would be requested, records examined, claims about charitable use verified. When money moves without paperwork, it doesn't stay invisible. Standing at the fence line as the sun dipped low, I thought about how quickly tradition becomes trespass when ownership changes hands, and how slowly people notice when no one checks. She sold my trees, believing history was permission. What ended it wasn't anger or confrontation. It was proof. And proof has a way of rearranging everything around it. The fallout didn't arrive all at once. It unfolded in layers, each one quieter than the last, but heavier in consequence. Once the stand came down, people expected things to calm quickly. They didn't. When money, property, and false authority intersect, resolution takes time. The HOA issued the correction notice the next morning. It went to every resident and was posted publicly near the former stand location. It confirmed that the Pine Farm was private property, that the sale had been unauthorized, and that refunds would be issued to anyone who had purchased trees. The language was careful, unmistakably legal, and deliberately free of emotion. That alone changed the conversation. Residents who had defended the sale stopped doing so. Those who had questioned it quietly felt validated. The idea that the land had always been open collapsed the moment it was contradicted in writing. Tradition doesn't survive documentation. Refunds began that afternoon. The HOA set up a temporary claims process, asking buyers to submit proof of purchase. Many had paid cash, but enough transactions had been logged digitally to establish scope. The total amount collected was higher than I'd expected. Not staggering, but significant enough to make it clear this wasn't a casual holiday activity. Karen's absence became noticeable. She didn't respond to messages. She didn't attend any follow-up meetings. Her role in the neighborhood, once so visible, vanished completely. When people asked the board what would happen to her, the answer was always the same. The matter was under review. Under review is what institutions say when they can't undo something. The county followed up with me midweek, requesting an itemized valuation of the trees sold. I provided market rates, species data, and age estimates. Agriculture doesn't guess. It measures. Each tree had a value, and each value added weight to the case. Consumer Protection contacted me as well. They asked whether I had granted permission for any charitable use of the trees. I hadn't. They asked whether any representation had been made to buyers about ownership. I forwarded screenshots of the signs and photos of the donation jar. That was enough. By Friday, the HOA board sent a second notice. This one announced the suspension of the volunteer involved, pending investigation. No name was used, but no one needed it. The absence had already identified her. Neighbors began approaching me, not angrily, not defensively, but thoughtfully. They asked how the boundaries had been missed for so long. They admitted they'd assumed HOA authority, extended everywhere nearby. Some apologized for dismissing my initial concerns. I told them it wasn't personal. Assumptions spread easily when no one checks them. That weekend, I walked the farm again. The rows felt thinner, but intact. I marked the remaining trees for future harvest and scheduled replacement plantings. Land doesn't hold grudges. It just requires stewardship. I received a final update from the HOA late Sunday. They agreed to full restitution for the trees sold, to be paid directly. They also committed to installing clear boundary signage, acknowledging private ownership. The board's legal counsel signed off on the message. It wasn't victory. It was correction. Karen had believed confidence and tradition were enough to claim someone else's property. She believed no one would push back hard enough or quietly enough to force accountability. She was wrong. By exposing the sale, I hadn't just protected my land. I'd corrected a story that had been repeated too long without proof. And once a false story is corrected publicly, it doesn't come back the same way again. By the start of the following week, the situation had shifted from neighborhood drama to a formal process. What had begun as a holiday tradition was now a documented case moving through multiple offices, each one slower and more precise than the last. That's how real consequences arrive, not loudly, but methodically. The county scheduled a site visit to the farm, not because they doubted ownership, but because verification is part of procedure. 2 officials walked the rows with me, checking stump locations against my photos, measuring diameters, confirming species. They didn't speculate or editorialize. They verified. Every cut matched the timeline I documented. Every removed tree aligned with the sale dates. Their report would be clean. That mattered. Consumer protection followed with a written request for transaction details. They wanted copies of signage, pricing, and any claims made to buyers about where proceeds were going. I provided everything I had. The donation jar label, the chalkboard sign, the photos of Karen directing customers. Misrepresentation doesn't require intent to be actionable. It only requires effect. The HOA's internal investigation moved just as quietly. Board members stopped speculating and started recording. Minutes were taken carefully. Council reviewed communications. Email chains were preserved. The association wasn't trying to defend the action anymore. It was trying to show it hadn't authorized it. Distance had become the priority. Karen's name surfaced officially for the first time in a county notice that arrived midweek. Not an accusation, an inquiry. A request for explanation. A deadline. That kind of letter changes behavior fast. When authority speaks without emotion, there's no room left for performance. She didn't respond publicly. Neighbors began to adjust in subtle ways. People stopped referring to the farm as the open land. They called it what it was, private property. Language changed first. Behavior followed. Once words shift, assumptions usually collapse behind them. I installed boundary markers that weekend. Simple, visible, and factual. No warnings. No threats. Just clarity. The markers weren't there to provoke. They were there to prevent the next misunderstanding before it could form. The HOA reimbursed me for the sold trees on Friday. Full market value, no negotiation. The payment came with a brief letter acknowledging unauthorized use and confirming corrective measures. Legal counsel signed it. That signature meant the matter was no longer about goodwill. It was about record. The stand never returned. Where it had been, there was only empty pavement and a faint outline where tables had sat. No decorations. No signs. No customers. The season moved on without it. People found trees elsewhere, and the neighborhood didn't fall apart because of it. Traditions adapt faster than people expect. Late that evening, I walked the farm one more time. The missing trees were noticeable, but not devastating. Replanting would take years, but land works on long timelines. One season doesn't define it. I thought about how easily this could have gone differently if I'd reacted emotionally instead of procedurally. If I'd argued instead of documenting. If I tried to shame instead of clarify. The outcome would have dragged on, fueled by denial and noise. Instead, the truth had done its work quietly. Karen had sold my Christmas trees, believing confidence and tradition would protect her. What ended it wasn't outrage. It was verification. And verification, once introduced, tends to stay. By the time December settled in fully, the story had stopped circulating as gossip and started existing as fact. Not the dramatic version people like to embellish, but the documented one, the kind that sits quietly in records and changes behavior without needing to be repeated. The HOA moved carefully now. Communications were shorter, clearer, and grounded in maps and boundaries instead of assumptions. The board added a standing requirement that any seasonal activity near the edge of the neighborhood had to be verified against county records before approval. That single step would have prevented everything that had happened. People noticed. Conversations shifted from, "That's how it's always been," to "Who actually owns that?" It was a subtle change, but an important one. Once people learn to ask ownership questions, informal authority loses most of its power. Karen remained absent, not just from a stand, but from anything community-facing. No events, no organizing, no seasonal announcements. Her name came up only in the context of a situation, never attached to a defense. Silence isn't always guilt, but it often signals that options have run out. I received confirmation from Consumer Protection near the end of the week. They had closed the inquiry with findings of misrepresentation and unauthorized sales. Any further action would depend on restitution and compliance, both of which had already occurred. The system wasn't interested in punishment at that point. It was interested in correction. Correction had been achieved. Neighbors approached me differently now. Not cautiously, not defensively, respectfully. Some admitted they'd assumed the farm was open land because it had been treated that way for so long. Others said they'd always wondered but never thought to check. No one argued anymore. The facts were too clear. I spent time planning the farm's future instead of defending its past. New plantings, better fencing, clear signage, long-term harvest cycles. Land rewards attention more than it rewards confrontation, and I was ready to give it that. One afternoon, a family drove past slowly and stopped at the fence. They asked politely whether the farm would be selling trees next year. Not demanding, not assuming, asking. That moment mattered. I told them yes, when the time was right and on proper terms. They thanked me and drove on. No conflict, no confusion, just clarity. That's what ownership looks like when it's respected. As the season moved toward Christmas, the absence of the stand stopped feeling strange. It became normal. People adjusted. Traditions shifted. What mattered most, the holiday, went on unchanged. The idea that one unauthorized sale had been essential turned out to be false. It always is. Karen had believed tradition and confidence were enough to sell what wasn't hers. What she'd learned instead was that tradition doesn't override deeds, and confidence doesn't survive records. The pine farm stood quiet under winter light, rows of trees waiting patiently for seasons to come. And for the first time since buying it, I felt certain that the boundaries were understood. Not because I'd argued for them, but because I'd proven them. The farm felt different once everything was settled, not emptier, not quieter, just honest. Winter light filtered through the remaining pines, long shadows stretching across the ground where a few trees had been taken too early. The land didn't feel violated anymore. It felt respected. That distinction mattered. The HOA never mentioned the incident again. Not in meetings. Not in emails. Not in casual conversation. Silence wasn't denial, it was acceptance. The board had learned where its authority ended, and more importantly, it had learned what happened when those limits were ignored. Procedures replaced assumptions. Maps replaced memory. Documentation replaced tradition. Karen never returned to any public role. She remained in the neighborhood, but her presence was subdued and private. No organizing. No announcements. No seasonal initiatives. The confidence she once wore like armor had been stripped away by something she couldn't talk over or dismiss. Records. Once authority is disproven publicly, it doesn't quietly rebuild itself. The county closed its file after restitution was confirmed. Consumer Protection marked the case resolved. No fines were announced. No spectacle followed. The system had done what it was designed to do: stop the behavior, correct the record, and prevent repetition. That was enough. I finalized plans for the next planting cycle in early January. New saplings would go in where the old ones had been taken. It would take years before they reached full height, but that was always the nature of farming. Land rewards patience more than speed. It doesn't care about shortcuts. Neighbors adjusted quickly. People stopped referring to the farm as open space and started calling it what it was: private land. When someone talked about activities near the boundary, the first question now was ownership. That one habit shift prevented more conflict than any fence ever could. One evening, just before leaving for a longer stretch away, I walked the rows one last time. Snow had begun to gather on branches, softening everything. The stumps were still visible, but they no longer felt raw. They felt accounted for. That's what resolution looks like, not erasure, but acknowledgement. Karen had sold my Christmas trees, believing tradition gave her permission. What ended it wasn't confrontation or outrage. It was proof, presented calmly and completely. The farm stood quiet behind me as I locked the gate and drove away, confident that absence would no longer be mistaken for access. Boundaries were clear. Records were set. The story had been corrected. And corrected stories don't repeat themselves the same way twice.